Welcome back to Yang Daily. I'll be your host, Alex Cheney, bringing you all the Yang news you need to live your life right. All right, so there's about 10 stories that I didn't have time to fit in today, partially because we have a really big story to cover, and partially because there's just too much going on, which is why it's poor timing to announce that I'll be gone Friday, as I have a birthday party to attend. We've got a very heavy episode today. Most of it is not going to be any fun at all, but there is an item toward the end that might make up for it. Stick with me. Shout out to our Tier 3 patrons, Peter Park and Shay Meehan, as well as all our other patrons. This would not be possible without all of you. Starting off light, did you know that SSI and other welfare programs have asset limits as a requirement? What that means is that, for instance, you can't get SSI if you have more than $2,000 in money or other assets. $2,000. Basically, you have to nearly be bankrupt before you can get help and stay nearly bankrupt to continue receiving it. It's insane. Our safety nets do not provide safety at all. We need UBI. According to a comparison of USDA and Census Bureau numbers, which are not exact apples-to-apples comparison, but close enough, hunger in U.S. households has almost tripled between 2019 and August of this year. Even more alarming, the proportion of American children who sometimes don't have enough to eat is now as much as 14 times higher than last year. While the deaths from COVID are horrendous, remember that there are so many other terrible consequences of our leadership's mismanagement of the pandemic, with none more to blame than our president. Speaking of, we're going to review a recent article by Barton Gellman about how incredibly unprepared our election laws are to handle what Trump is likely to cook up in the coming months. It's a very long article, but very important. The short and skinny of it would be that there are 1,000 possible paths if no one concedes, and none of them are good. What follows is mostly paraphrased from the article. First, we have to understand the degree of election rigging that will go down. We already covered Florida's new poll tax, but that's only a tiny piece. Republicans are very practiced at this. They have also litigated scores of cases in the names of preventing fraud in this year's election. State by state, they have sought, with some success, to purge voter rolls, tighten rules on provisional votes, uphold voter ID requirements, ban the use of ballot drop boxes, reduce eligibility for vote by mail, discard mail-in ballots with technical flaws, and outlaw the counting of ballots that are postmarked on Election Day but arrive afterward. Postmaster DeJoy also tried to remove the treatment of ballots as first-class mail unless some states nearly tripled the postage that they pay on them, but that plan was withdrawn under fire from critics. Then there's the courts in 2018 allowing the consent decree to expire. The decree was a law very similar to the Voting Rights Act, forcing a judicial review of any new ballot measures before they are enacted. It came about from the New Jersey gubernatorial election of 1981, in which the RNC allegedly tried to intimidate voters by hiring off-duty cops as members of an armed National Ballot Security Task Force, who stopped and questioned voters in minority neighborhoods, blocked voters from entering the polls, forcibly restrained poll workers, challenged people's eligibility to vote, warned of criminal charges for casting an illegal ballot, and generally did their best to frighten voters away from the polls. The law was allowed to lapse for the most outrageous reason possible, because it was working, and Republicans had not recently tried to pass a measure, so it was deemed unnecessary. Well, guess what happened next? With a judge no longer watching, Republicans are recruiting 50,000 volunteers in 15 contested states to monitor polling places and challenge voters they deem suspicious looking. I think we can guess which ones those will be. Trump called into Fox News on August 20th to tell Sean Hannity, quote, "We are going to have sheriffs and we're going to have law enforcement and we're going to have, hopefully, U.S. attorneys," end quote, to keep close watch on the polls. Of course, this year, mail-in ballots will be more important than ever, and they have plenty of details for Trump's lawyers to attack. Technical errors are common at every step. If voters supply a new address, or if they write a different version of their name, or if their signature doesn't match, or if they print their name instead of signing, or if they sign in the wrong place, or if they fail to seal the ballot inside the inner security envelope, or if the date was wrong, or if there is no postmark or the postmark is illegible, their votes may not count. In person, mistakes can be corrected by a poll worker if the poll worker chooses to, but mail-in voters are mostly on their own. And Trump is employing record numbers of people specifically to look for any excuse to throw them out. As one example, Trump put out ads for thousands of signature challengers who stand over the shoulders of the expert verifying that signatures match what's on record, and they can challenge the decision on every mail-in ballot for further review, knowing that some will be thrown out and twice as many Democrats as Republicans are voting by mail. This is why Trump and Republicans will do anything they can to get mail-in ballots thrown out, and why you may want to consider voting in person. But you can bet Trump will call for mail-in ballots to be discounted altogether as well. He already did in Florida's last election. When the mail-in ballot count began pulling the vote in the Democrats' direction, Trump tweeted, quote, "The Florida election should be called in favor of Rick Scott and Ron DeSantis in that large numbers of new ballots showed up out of nowhere, and many ballots are missing or forged. An honest vote count is no longer possible. Ballots massively infected. Must go with election night." End quote. Note that this is our president advocating for throwing out a huge chunk of votes, including those of our military overseas, solely because they are not going in his favor. There was no evidence of fraud. Trump will attempt to declare victory on election night, knowing that most Democratic votes are yet uncounted. Where it gets even more frightening is how Trump and friends might get creative. The author supposes, what if caravans of armed Trump supporters converge on big city polling places on election day? They say they've come to investigate reports on social media of voter fraud. We've clearly seen plenty of such gangs arrive at police brutality and racism protests. Counter-protesters arrive, fistfights break out, shots are fired, and voters flee or can't reach the polls. Now Trump has an excuse to declare an emergency. He's already threatened to invoke the Insurrection Act on Election Day if anything happens. All he has to do is ensure something happens. Federal troops move in to restore order and secure the building. They close the streets that lead to the polls. They take custody of uncounted ballots. Who knows what happens next? There are other excuses as well. The venues of intervention could be post offices. The predicate could be an intelligence report or forged ballots sent from China. Any excuse will be found. Ballots will disappear. There will be countless legal battles as the mail-in votes are being counted for weeks. The interregnum allots 35 days for the count and its attendant lawsuits to be resolved. On the 36th day, December 8th, an important deadline arrives, that being the day electors of the Electoral College must be appointed. Since the late 19th century, every state has ceded the appointment of electors to voters. However, this is only a norm, and norms mean nothing to Trump. Article 2 mandates each state shall appoint electors, quote, "in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct," end quote. Trump will test this. According to sources in the Republican Party at the state and national levels, the Trump campaign is discussing contingency plans to bypass election results and appoint loyal electors in battleground states where Republicans hold the legislative majority. With a justification based on claims of rampant fraud, Trump would ask state legislators to set aside the popular vote and exercise their power to choose a slate of electors directly. The longer Trump succeeds in keeping the vote count in doubt, the more pressure legislators will feel to act before the safe harbor deadline expires. We've already seen how willing Republican politicians have been to cede their values for Trump. Trump would rally his base to exact a high price on any Republican legislator who stands by the popular vote, and by this point, party officials would be invested in a narrative of fraud. A Trump campaign legal advisor told Gelman the push to appoint electors would be framed in terms of protecting the people's will. Once committed to the position that the overtime count has been rigged, state lawmakers will want to judge for themselves what the voters intended. Here's the hammer. Republicans control the legislative chambers in all 6 of the most closely contested battleground states. mostly due to gerrymandering. In the states with Democratic governors, they could challenge the legislature, saying the voters are already selected electors for Biden. Then there would be separate electors for Biden and Trump, both claiming legitimacy. The decision would kick up to Congress. This will be after the congressional races are decided. If one party controls both House and Senate, they will win. If it's divided, there are many laws that will be invoked and challenged, and the article lays out the incredible mess of political gamesmanship that would ensue. The result could be any of thousands, many of which would end in legal stalemate, some of which would even result in 3 people claiming to be the legitimate next president, with Pelosi being the third. Another terrifying element is how a newly lopsided Supreme Court ruling would come into play, which is why McConnell and Trump are so desperate to rush the nomination of RBG's replacement. It's absolute madness, and it's almost certain to happen, and not even the experts who ran dozens of simulations could find a solution. All that can be said is that Trump will refuse any outcome other than victory, will try to cheat however he can, and that the outcome will be ugly and disastrous, and potentially the end of democracy. That's what we're headed for, and unfortunately, I don't have any advice for you, other than to do whatever you must to make your vote count, and make sure Democrats take the Senate by volunteering and donating to the Senate races we discussed yesterday. Speaking of the Supreme Court, Romney just released a statement that, if I'm reading it right, says he will go along with the pre-election nomination because the Republicans' partisan decision in Obama's last term sets the precedent that they should be partisan again here. Seriously, I had a lot of respect for Romney before this, not so much now. This means it is almost certain Trump will install a new justice before the election is decided, and he just came out yesterday and said that he wants a new justice so that there is a Republican bias on the court when the election case comes before them, implying that he has already decided that the courts will choose the winner, not the people. All right, so that's some heavy stuff. Let's move on. Donna Imam's signs in Williamson County are now being cut down by the opposition. Not only is this outrageous, it's happening because she's on the cusp of unseating the incumbent. Let your outrage fuel you to help push her over the crest by volunteering and donating today. Humanity Forward is looking to hire a digital intern to manage online media. It's a remote position and you can apply at the link below. Matt started a thread for recognizing underappreciated YangGang advocates, people who do a lot of work without a lot of fanfare. I added Alex Howlett, Income Movement, and Giselle Huff as some of the most influential people and groups fighting for UBI in the trenches who sadly get very little attention or followers. Visit the thread to contribute your own underloved Humanity First warriors and to find some new people to follow. Finally, this has been a real downer of an episode. I get that. You could probably use a little something that might give you some hope to carry on. I might have just the thing. Yesterday, Yang tweeted that he may have just convinced someone to support UBI. That same day, Joe Biden made an announcement that his campaign will initiate an advisory council on small business and entrepreneurship, and that the council will include our very own Andrew Yang. Yeah, really. The council will guide Biden on how to assist small businesses through the economic crisis, meaning Andrew will be giving input on his area of expertise and in prime position to push UBI as part of that solution. Yang makes the 8th presidential candidate to be brought into Biden's team, with each being given a position that plays to their strength and expertise. Say what you want of Biden, you gotta admit, dude knows how to build a coalition of the rational, which is exactly what most people are craving right now. This is fantastic news, and a major surprise. It means that should Biden win, Yang will likely have a role in his cabinet, and I dare not even speculate on Yang's tweet. I'll take the certain victory for now. And that'll do it for today's Yang Daily. Bookmark and share the Hunger article, the Election Apocalypse article, and Yang making Biden's counsel. Express your disappointment to Romney. Help Donna overcome her cheating opponent. Visit the YangGang Advocates thread. help recruit other organizations to the cause and get everyone to sign the UBI petition, flood Congress and Trump with calls, tweets, and letters using the Resist Bot or Income Movement easy contacts below. If you need help, consult Humanity Forward, the Income Movement Aid Database, the Mission Asset Fund, United Way, or the H3 podcast thread. And don't forget to Yang Daily.